April 4, 1968, Memphis, Tennessee. A single gunshot ripped through the evening air outside the Lorraine Motel. Within hours, America was told the story. Martin Luther King Jr., the most recognizable civil rights leader in the world, had been assassinated by a lone white drifter named James Earl Ray. Case closed. But more than 50 years later, that simple explanation no longer sits comfortably with many historians, investigators, jurors, and even members of King's own family. Because behind the official version lies a far darker narrative, one involving federal surveillance, psychological warfare, infiltration, organized crime networks, and intelligence operations. A narrative that suggests Dr. King may not have been killed by a lone gunman, but eliminated through a coordinated conspiracy linking government agencies and organized crime. This is not a claim made lightly. It is built from declassified FBI documents, sworn testimony, court rulings, intelligence leaks, and decades of independent investigation. To understand why so many people reject the official story, we must begin with one uncomfortable fact. The FBI did not merely observe Martin Luther King Jr., they actively tried to destroy him. By the early 1960s, King had become the most influential black leader in America. He had mobilized millions. He had embarrassed segregationists. He had forced presidents to act. And perhaps most dangerous of all, he had begun connecting civil rights with economic justice, labor rights, and opposition to war. In 1967, King publicly condemned the Vietnam War. He called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Those words detonated inside Washington. Within months, King's approval among political elites collapsed. President Lyndon Johnson distanced himself. Major newspapers turned hostile, but no institution reacted more aggressively than the FBI. Under Director J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau classified King as a radical, a subversive, and a potential communist asset. None of those claims were ever proven, but Hoover did not require proof. He required control. The FBI launched an operation against King under its infamous COINTELPRO program. COINTELPRO's purpose was simple: neutralize domestic political movements before they could destabilize existing power structures. Not monitor. Not investigate. Neutralize. Methods included illegal wiretaps, bugged hotel rooms, forged letters, blackmail campaigns, psychological pressure, encouragement of internal conflict. King's phones were tapped. His hotel rooms were bugged. His private life was recorded. And then came one of the most chilling acts in FBI history. In 1964, the FBI anonymously mailed King a package. Inside were recordings of his private conversations. Along with a typed letter, the letter urged King to kill himself. It warned that his filthy, abnormal behavior would soon be exposed. The message was clear: end your life or we will destroy you. This is not speculation. The letter exists. It sits today in the National Archives. The FBI never denied sending it. Ask yourself, if a federal agency is willing to psychologically push a Nobel Peace Prize winner towards suicide, what else might they be willing to do? By 1968, King was planning something far more dangerous than marches. He was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a massive multiracial movement aimed at economic restructuring, not reforms. Restructuring. King intended to bring tens of thousands of poor Americans to Washington and shut down the Capitol through sustained, nonviolent occupation. This terrified political leaders. Civil rights could be negotiated. Economic revolution could not. At the same time, King was supporting striking sanitation workers in Memphis, workers who were defying city officials, corporate interests, and local power brokers. Memphis was tense. The National Guard was on standby. Police were heavily armed. King returned to Memphis despite threats against his life. He told close associates, "I may not get there with you." The night before his death, King delivered his famous mountaintop speech. He spoke of having seen the promised land. He spoke of not fearing death. Many would later say it sounded like a farewell. On April 4th, King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. At 6:01 p.m., a rifle shot struck his jaw and spinal cord. He collapsed. Within an hour, he was dead. Within days, police announced they had identified James Earl Ray as the shooter. Ray fled the country. He was captured months later in London. He eventually pled guilty, then immediately recanted. Ray insisted he was a pawn, that he had been manipulated by shadowy figures, that he never fired the fatal shot. His claims were dismissed as lies, but over time cracks began to form. Ballistics inconsistencies, witness contradictions, evidence mishandling, destroyed files, missing photographs, unexplained intelligence presence in Memphis. And perhaps most disturbing, the King family themselves would eventually conclude that James Earl Ray did not act alone, or at all, which raises the question: if Ray wasn't the shooter, who was, and who benefited from King's death? James Earl Ray was not a master assassin. He was not highly trained. He had no military sniper background. He had no history of political ideology. He was a career criminal, mostly known for petty theft and prison escapes. Yet we are told this man purchased a high-powered rifle, stalked King, positioned himself perfectly, fired a fatal shot from a crowded boarding house, escaped unseen, left behind a bundle of evidence containing his fingerprints. It almost sounds too perfect. Suspiciously perfect. Ray's alleged rifle was found in a bundle near the scene. So were binoculars. So were personal items with his name, almost as if someone wanted police to find them. Ray maintained until his death in 1998 that he was set up. He claimed he had been working with a mysterious man named Earl, a handler who directed his movements, paid his expenses, provided transportation, arranged weapons purchases. Ray said he never understood the full purpose of what he was being drawn into. Investigators laughed off the Earl story, but later inquiries found multiple witnesses who independently recalled a man matching Earl's description interacting with Ray in different cities. Even more troubling, Ray had little money, yet he traveled extensively across North America and Europe. Someone was funding him. Ballistics testing created further doubt. The rifle allegedly used could not be conclusively matched to the bullet that killed King. The FBI quietly admitted this, yet prosecutors still claimed certainty. Eyewitnesses also contradicted the official account. Several witnesses reported seeing a man fleeing from bushes near the motel, not from the boarding house bathroom window where Ray was supposed to have fired. Some witnesses initially pointed police toward those bushes. Police soon cut down the bushes. They were removed, evidence destroyed. Why? Then came the 1999 civil trial. The King family sued Memphis businessman Lloyd Jowers, who claimed involvement in a conspiracy. The jury heard 70 witnesses over 4 weeks. They reviewed decades of evidence. They concluded King was killed as the result of a conspiracy involving multiple parties, including government agencies. This verdict received almost no mainstream coverage, but it legally stands. Coretta Scott King called the verdict a great victory for truth. She publicly stated that Ray was not the shooter. So why is this trial rarely mentioned? Because it directly contradicts the lone gunman narrative. Now we must ask a deeper question. If Ray was a pawn who might have been pulling the strings, two entities appear repeatedly in declassified files and testimony: the FBI and organized crime. During the 1960s, the FBI publicly claimed to be waging war on the mafia. Privately, the relationship was far more complex. The FBI frequently used mob figures as informants, protected certain criminals, leveraged organized crime networks for intelligence operations, sometimes even collaborating when goals aligned. This was not unusual during Cold War intelligence culture. Morality took a back seat to utility. If the mafia could accomplish something deniably, they became useful, and King was becoming extremely inconvenient. King threatened. Corporate profits, military spending, political stability, racial hierarchy, economic power structures. Eliminating him would fracture the civil rights movement. It would slow mass mobilization. It would create fear. And importantly, if the murder could be blamed on a racist drifter, not the state, no revolution would follow. Only grief and chaos, which is exactly what happened. Riots erupted in over 100 cities. Leaders were thrown into disarray. The Poor People's Campaign collapsed. Momentum died. From a strategic standpoint, King's assassination achieved everything his enemies wanted. But the question remains, was this outcome merely exploited or deliberately engineered? To understand the possibility of FBI involvement, we must confront one uncomfortable truth. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover functioned less like a law enforcement agency and more like a domestic intelligence empire. Hoover ruled the Bureau for nearly 5 decades. He answered to presidents, but he also blackmailed them. He kept secret files on politicians, celebrities, judges, and activists. Those files gave him power. And Hoover despised Martin Luther King Jr., not privately, not subtly, openly. Internal memos described King as an immoral opportunist, the most dangerous Negro in America, a tool of communist forces. These were not fringe opinions. They were official bureau language. Hoover believed King was capable of destabilizing the entire nation, not because King was violent, but because he was effective. By 1963, the FBI had placed King under total surveillance. Phones, hotels, meetings, associates, every major civil rights organization was infiltrated. Informants were embedded everywhere. Agents followed King constantly. This surveillance went far beyond national security. It became obsession. Thousands of pages of files were compiled. Most are still sealed today. Those that have been released paint a disturbing picture. The Bureau sought not merely to monitor King, but to neutralize him. COINTELPRO documents explicitly outline strategies such as creating distrust among King's allies, leaking damaging rumors to the press, undermining financial support, encouraging public humiliation, pushing him toward emotional collapse. One memo states the goal: prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. King fit that description perfectly. By 1967, King had crossed a red line. He opposed the Vietnam War. This transformed him from civil rights leader into anti-war dissident. In Cold War America, that was unforgivable. The FBI began increasing pressure. Wiretaps intensified. Media leaks increased. Friendly journalists were quietly fed negative stories. King's donors were warned. His allies were pressured. At the same time, Army intelligence placed King on a watch list. Military intelligence units operated domestically in Memphis during King's visit. This fact alone shocks many people. Why was Army intelligence monitoring a peaceful preacher? Because King was no longer viewed as simply a protester. He was viewed as a destabilizing force. Multiple witnesses later reported seeing unusual federal presence around the Lorraine Motel. Black firefighters assigned nearby were mysteriously reassigned that day. A specialized police unit usually protecting King was withdrawn. King's regular bodyguard was told not to accompany him. Security protocols were inexplicably altered. Every protective layer weakened. Coincidence or preparation? One of the most disturbing aspects involves a man named Earl Clark. Clark was a Memphis police officer with alleged mob connections. Several witnesses claimed Clark was positioned in the bushes near the Lorraine Motel, the same bushes witnesses initially pointed to after the shooting. Lloyd Jowers later claimed Clark fired the fatal shot. Clark died before he could testify. No serious investigation followed. So where does organized crime fit in? The mafia had deep roots in Memphis. Controlled gambling, controlled labor rackets, controlled trucking. King's support of sanitation workers directly threatened mob-controlled labor systems. Additionally, some mob figures were long-time FBI informants. This created a shadow relationship. Mobsters provided information. The FBI provided protection. In this environment, plausible deniability flourished. If the FBI wanted something done quietly, they did not have to pull the trigger. They could facilitate, look away, provide intelligence, ensure evidence disappeared, allow others to act. Several intelligence veterans have admitted that during the Cold War, assassination was not unthinkable. The CIA plotted to kill foreign leaders, poisoned cigars, exploding seashells. Mafia hitmen were considered as assets in those plots. If the government was willing to assassinate foreign leaders, is it truly impossible they considered removing a domestic dissident, especially one they viewed as revolutionary? After King's death, the FBI publicly celebrated the collapse of his movement. Internal memos reveal satisfaction. Hoover personally congratulated agents. Yet when asked decades later about FBI involvement, the Bureau denies everything. They claim no evidence exists, but many relevant files remain sealed. Some were destroyed. Others are classified until 2027. Why hide files if there is nothing to hide? Transparency would end the debate. Secrecy fuels it. This does not prove the FBI ordered the assassination, but it establishes motive. It establishes capability. It establishes history of targeting King. It establishes willingness to break the law. And it establishes a system where organized crime could act as deniable muscle. Which brings us to the final question. If King was eliminated through a hidden alliance, what does that mean for America's understanding of itself? When analyzing any assassination, one principle matters most: follow the benefits. Who gained power? Who avoided losses? Who saw their problems disappear? Martin Luther King Jr.'s death created immediate political and social shifts. The Poor People's Campaign lost momentum. Without King's leadership, coordination collapsed. No mass occupation of Washington occurred. No sustained economic disruption followed. The anti-war movement lost its most morally powerful voice. Corporate America breathed easier. Military contractors faced less unified opposition. Political leaders no longer faced a charismatic figure capable of uniting multiple movements into one force. The civil rights movement fractured into competing factions. Some turned toward militant rhetoric, others retreated. Division replaced unity. From a strategic standpoint, King's removal was devastatingly effective. No single figure ever replaced him, not because others lacked courage, but because King occupied a unique position in history. He had moral authority, media reach, international respect, grassroots credibility, and a growing revolutionary vision. That combination terrified those in power. Meanwhile, James Earl Ray rotted in prison. He repeatedly requested a trial. He wanted to present evidence. He wanted witnesses called. The state refused. A full public trial would have risked exposing inconsistencies. It would have required examination of ballistics, witnesses, intelligence presence. Better to keep Ray silent behind bars. Better to maintain the lone gunman story. The King family never accepted that story. Coretta Scott King stated plainly, "There is abundant evidence of a major high-level conspiracy." Martin Luther King I said, "I don't believe Ray pulled the trigger." Bernice King said, "My father was assassinated, and the government was involved." These are not fringe bloggers. These are the people who knew King best, who lived with the consequences, who spent decades reviewing evidence. If the conspiracy theory is true, it forces a painful conclusion. That American democracy has limits. That dissent beyond a certain point becomes intolerable. That peaceful resistance is tolerated only as long as it does not threaten foundational power structures. King himself warned of this. He said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. When the demand becomes too strong, power responds with force, not always openly, sometimes quietly, sometimes through proxies, sometimes through shadows. Believing this possibility does not require hating America. It requires acknowledging history. The Tuskegee experiments, COINTELPRO, Watergate, MK Ultra, Iran-Contra, Pentagon Papers, all were once dismissed as conspiracy theories. All were later proven true. The pattern is clear. Government secrecy often hides wrongdoing. Only decades later does truth emerge. And sometimes, even decades are not enough. More than half a century has passed since Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. Children born after his death are now grandparents, yet the questions remain, not because people enjoy conspiracy, but because the official story collapses under scrutiny, because evidence contradicts it, because powerful institutions refuse full transparency, because those who loved King reject it, because too many coincidences point in one direction, toward coordination, toward planning, toward something far bigger than one angry racist pulling a trigger. History is often written by those who survive, those who control archives, those who control classification stamps. Truth does not always emerge cleanly. Sometimes it leaks, sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits. The possibility that Martin Luther King Jr. was eliminated through a hidden alliance between government forces and organized crime is terrifying. Not just because it suggests murder, but because it suggests something worse. That moral leadership can be erased. That peaceful revolution can be sabotaged. That justice is negotiable. King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." But arcs do not bend by themselves. They are bent by people, by courage, by persistence, by refusal to accept comfortable lies. The greatest threat to power is not violence. It is truth, truth organized, truth spoken, truth demanded. Perhaps that is why King had to be silenced, not because he hated, not because he killed, but because he inspired. If the full truth about King's death ever emerges, it will not come from those who benefited. It will come from citizens who refuse to stop asking questions, who refuse to forget, who refuse to accept simple answers for complex crimes. Because a nation that cannot confront its darkest possibilities can never truly be free. And the haunting question remains, was Martin Luther King Jr. murdered by a lone racist? Or was he eliminated because he was becoming too powerful to live? That question may define America's conscience forever. Conscience forever.